Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. One thing which is fairly controversial across the United Kingdom is the subject of school uniforms. Should children have to wear them? And what if their parents don't have enough money to buy the uniform for the children? Well, you would think that in a country like the UK, everyone is quite affluent, at least enough to buy clothes for their children, but you might be surprised to learn that that's not the case. Money is tight everywhere, and the only difference perhaps between your country and my country is that if you are not working here, or if you don't have enough money, then the government will give you cash. Usually in the form of a benefit, but sometimes in the form of a loan. Getting back to the topic of school uniforms, when I was at school, the subject of school uniforms was non-negotiable. You found the money to buy a uniform, or else you couldn't go to school. If you went to school without a uniform, it was simple. You got sent home and you got told to come back when you had one. Perhaps in some sympathetic schools, things were different. Now, in recent years, things are very different. Many schools just don't have uniforms. It's easier than trying to force parents or shame parents who can't afford it. It depends where you are in the UK. It also depends what school you go to, if it's private or public. But in Northern Ireland right now, families should be given more choice over where to buy children's school uniforms. That's the headline of a local newspaper. The problem is partly because usually there are only one or two shops which are allowed to sell the school uniform. If you can imagine the number of schools we have, there's usually a contract with a particular provider. Not only for the shirts and ties and the colours and these things, but also for the sports uniform, because you have to have special colours and sizes for people doing sports, as well as the usual uniform, which is the trousers or skirt or blazers. Somebody said that during the pandemic, the uniform for physical exercise went from £5 to £18 literally overnight because it has a certain sports logo on it. And that sounds really bad. They're also saying that certain materials for uniforms, particularly for private schools, creates an added cost. One thing to keep in mind, as I've mentioned before, is that the UK is split into 4 separate countries. It's a union, and each of those countries has very specific ways of looking at whether a school uniform is necessary or not. And the education department largely leaves it up to the local school to make its own policies with regards to things like school uniforms, bearing in mind that the northern parts of the UK, such as Scotland and Ireland, as well as the north of England, these areas tend to be very impoverished. It's not the fact that there isn't money there, but people aren't empowered. When you live in a community where everyone seems to be claiming benefits from the government, there isn't a lot of business there perhaps. then people don't often take pride in their appearance. If money is tight, you would think that benefits, though, would maybe compensate for that, but people seem to have a feeling that they're getting benefits and therefore they should act as if they're poor. The people who are receiving benefits may have other social issues such as alcohol or drug abuse, and all of these things together mean that school uniforms come quite far down the list if you're struggling to buy food, especially these days. So what's being done to try to resolve this issue? Well, as I mentioned earlier, families are saying that they should have more choice over where to buy the children's school uniform, because if it's the local shop who charges a fortune for it, and for example, someone else could do it cheaper, or if it could be ordered online perhaps, then they should certainly have more opportunities. But that's not really dealing with the problem, that's just dealing with the symptom. There's a much deeper problem there about who can afford school uniforms. Are school uniforms necessary? And Northern Ireland, because it's not in the middle of London, would perhaps have been dealing with this problem a little bit later than everybody else. There is an opinion here in the UK that London usually gets the cash and moves forward quicker than everybody else. And that's creating a north and south divide. The last Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, introduced a programme that he called Levelling Up. And that means ensuring that people in the north and south have exactly the same opportunities. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. It's about history, it's about industry, it's about availability, and also about health. How things are managed in London are very different from the way our local governments manage them in the north. So Northern Ireland would be perhaps going over this issue of school uniforms, which in all likelihood is something which England dealt with 20 or 25 years ago. But certainly with this north and south divide, this kind of thing highlights just how different the north of the UK is from the south. In the BBC News story, which has been issued in the last few days, they're basically saying that the uniform situation in Northern Ireland is quite unique. The writer, or one of the contributors at least, says she has a son in primary school and a daughter in secondary school. You can get a generic uniform and get the emblem sewn on in England and Scotland, but in Northern Ireland, the material and the actual dress sense is very specific. And she said the uniform options in Northern Ireland were often attached to very specific labels, which is a little bit strange, but then they've always been a little bit more strict because of their history. They take great pride in their schools. She said the specific colours and certain materials for uniforms, particularly in grammar schools, could create an added cost. And therefore, what she is saying is there should be a cap. That means an amount which shops are having to follow, an amount which basically caps the limits, puts some kind of cap on there so that you can't pay £5 in one shop, £10 in the next shop, or £20 in another. There should be some kind of obligatory, compulsory limit to how much can be spent on these things. It's very interesting. There's also a grant that's a special amount of money that can be given if you need a school uniform and can't afford to get one. But all of this is kind of shaming, because if you're the only person in your community, for example, who applies for a grant and it is known, then of course the child may be laughed at school. If your child doesn't pay for the school meals and some other children have to, everyone will assume the child is poor and perhaps make fun of him. And that's not really good from a schooling perspective as well. There's also additional things like cardigans, which are often required, bearing in mind that this is a cold country. Sweaters and cardigans are a big part of school uniforms. And that's it. So I just wanted to explain to you that this is perhaps an issue that highlights the differences around the UK. Some areas are very traditional. They would want their school to have a uniform. Others, perhaps in the cities, are more relaxed. And in the south, it's not really such a big issue. But in the north, it's huge. And although they're trying to move on, as we can see here in Northern Ireland, it's a bit of a problem. That's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let's talk again soon. See you. Bye.